tomorrow, in our series in Talks in Hindi, we have Dr. Asmita Kabra of Ambedkar University speaking on Vikas, Visthapan or Vikat. This will be at 3 p.m. in the seminar room. Weekly seminar series, which is held, as you know, on Tuesday at 3 p.m. So Anil Nauria, Senior Fellow of the NMML, will be speaking next week, Tuesday, that is on the 10th of September. And the subject is English Anti-Imperialism, the Varied Lives of Willie Pearson. On the 11th of September, we have a public lecture in the series on Science, Society and Nature, and the speaker is Professor Shiv Vishwanathan of the O.P. Jindal Global University, Sonipat. The subject being Impending Battles, Science and Democracy. Our other series, India and the Wider World, as a public lecture on Thursday on the 12th of September at 3 p.m. by the present Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow, Mr. T.N. Nainan, on the web. We will be putting up next year's 2014 program very shortly, probably by next week. As you know, we have a tradition here of having a lecture by an eminent educationist and scholar of education on the 5th of September, not only to mark Teachers' Day, which is the birthday of the late former President Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, but also because we feel that the Nehru Memorial Museum is a forum where issues of public policy and significance must be debated in a spirit that brings together scholarship and public concern. It's a privilege for me to welcome Professor Vimala Ramachandran, who is Professor, Teacher in Management Development in the National University for Educational Planning and Administration. Professor Ramachandran has worked on elementary education, the education of girls and women's empowerment for many decades. She was very crucially involved in conceptualizing and launching Mahila Saamakhya in 1988-89, a well-known women's education program of the Government of India based in the Department of Education in the Ministry of Human Rights and Development. Professor Ramachandran established the Educational Resource Unit in 1998 as a network of researchers and practitioners working on education and empowerment. She has a very extensive list of publications. Just a very select few would include Vimala Ramachandran and Kameshwari Dhandhyala, Cartographies of Empowerment, Tracing the Journey of Mahila Saamakhya, which was published in 2012. Rashmi Sharma and Vimala Ramachandran, The Elementary Education System in India, Exploring Institutional Structure, Processes and Dynamics in 2008. Vimala Ramachandran's own edited work, Hierarchies of Access, Gender and Equity in Primary Education, 2004, and an earlier book, Getting Children Back to School, which she authored, Case Studies in Primary Education in 2003. The relationship, of course, between the struggle for access to education and the struggle for quality in education is one which occupies a very prominent place in our history. But it is probably true that even though it is a subject which we all think we know about, there are still miles to go in learning to think rigorously and seriously about it. We are especially privileged to have you today because for us, you are a scholar who bridges the world of the social sciences, conceptualizing history, society, economy, polity, and what, if I may be forgiven for calling the real world out there, the world where people attempt to actually change institutions and practices through real-life intervention. Often these are two different worlds. They shouldn't be, but that's the world we live in. And we welcome you particularly to our small seminar and look forward to what I'm sure will be a more stimulating talk. Equity and quality are two sides to the same coin in India's school education process.
Dr. Manish Rangarajan and friends in this room. Before I start, I just wanted to recount a conversation that I had with Professor Govinda, who had a look at my lecture, and it was quite a very interesting conversation, and I thought I should start with that. He essentially said that every teacher and every administrator knows that our school does not function. They also know that the average number of teaching days in India is far less than anywhere else in the world. The it could range from 140 to 180. But what he said significantly was that we as a country have become numb and insensitive to the situation that is obtained on the ground. The basic issue is that no one in civil society or political parties or the administration really cares about what is happening in education. And he said that we all conveniently blame the system. And we know that for the last at least 10 years, people have been testing children and learning levels. And he says, every year is just another data, just another event. And he says, this has actually added to the despair and helplessness of children. What is the point in just trying to do research or test when we are saying the same thing over and over again for almost 3 decades? And we don't see much change on the ground. Now it is quite unlike Professor Govinda to actually speak in this form, because he said that, tell me genuinely, if we teach, why will children not learn? So the fault is not with the children. The fault squarely lies with what we are teaching and how we are teaching and how much time we are actually devoting to children. And I just thought I should start with this because having read the draft of my lecture, this is what he said, that, we've been going round and round for so many years. But on the other hand, I also read a very uplifting story in the newspaper, not a newspaper, The Economist magazine, where there was a review of a book by someone called Amanda Ripley on the smartest kids in the world and how you get there. And what really struck me, and after that I tried to read whatever I could find on what she had written. Essentially the message is that you can turn the system around. Poland has succeeded. After 1999, they have turned the education system around right on its head. And they have made the system work. And there was one message that really struck me, was that he says, this is the message of the Minister of Education of Poland, that teachers should not think about the background of the students and who they are, but work with each one of them earnestly and rigorously and give students who need additional academic support and encouragement. So somewhere I think we know what to do. And I thought I should start with this because this sort of summarizes in many ways what I'm going to say. From early 1990s, India has seen so many different programs. Operation Blackboard to before that, the new education policy, National Policy on Education, then the DPEP and SSA. Yes, our enrollment rates have gone through the roof. It has literally gone through the roof. It's 116%, which is a gross enrollment ratio. But, and also they tell you that tens and thousands of teachers have been appointed. Tens and thousands of buildings have been built. And lots of money has gone into training of teachers. Teachers have been trained over and over again. Despite all this, there is a sense of disquiet when we talk about education. A few weeks back, a team of people I'm working with were conducting a focus group discussions in 4 districts of Rajasthan, trying to understand why girls who had reached up to class 8 dropped out after class 8. This is really a kind of a qualitative study, trying to understand what's happening on the ground. And over and over again, in most of the villages, what they heard was a class 8 student today cannot even read what a class 2 student could read when their parents, the people in the community, went to school, say maybe 20, 30 years ago. And it says many of these children actually enroll in secondary school because of all the incentives that they get, especially girls. But they drop out within a month or 2 because they're just not being able to cope. He says, don't come and ask us why the children are dropping out. He says, why don't you go and ask the school why the children are dropping out? So I think somewhere these messages are very strong which are coming from the ground. We know that mere access to schooling without commensurate focus on quality and on learning outcomes is actually completely meaningless. It's trying to say that I'll send you to school or I'll invite you for dinner but I'm not going to give you anything to eat. But what is even more disturbing is that when we look at even government-owned data, the data is telling you something, but people are not willing to look at it deep enough and long enough. If the gross enrollment ratio at primary is 116, with very little difference between boys and girls, it drops to 85 by the time we come to upper primary. I'm talking about class 6. And it further drops to 65 when we come into class 9. And it drops to 39 when we're talking about class year. Which means for every 100 children who join class 1, barely 40 are actually making it to class 11. Very crude. For many, many decades now that we have actually known that the social and economic status of a child is one of the strongest determinants of a child's educational attainment. Last 60 years of non-education data, I'm talking about NSS data, really brings it out most significantly. It brings it out very clearly. And we also know that there's a lot of research that shows that educational mortality of different classes or castes is different. And the cumulative burden of not learning and exclusion becomes actually very visible in higher education. Who reaches higher education? This was Salil Deshpande's work, which is quite significant for us to actually understand what is happening in higher education. Higher education is actually a kind of a mirror which is showing you what is happening down below. This is not new. Way back in 1977, we had education theorists around the world who talked about that the combination of educational charms of different classes is very different depending on which class you come from, which community you come from, and which locality you live in. So therefore this is not new. We've known this all over the world, that there is a very close correlation between who you are and what educational attainment you get. This does not mean that we don't do anything about it. And it does not mean also that we can't do anything about it. Actually, the gap in achievement starts growing when we go from preschool slowly up to higher education. The children who don't get preschool education don't do that well when it comes to primary. The children who don't learn in primary don't move on to upper primary, and it goes on. So therefore, for us to at one level argue that family socioeconomic characteristics is the most important predictor of whether you will do well in school or not is a very, very strong statement that we have to make about the education system today. This is because we know where things have worked, that the fight for equality in India is ultimately the struggle for quality education. That is in fact the bottom line. The struggle for equality or the fight for equality is not about access, it's about quality of education. How did we reach here? How is it that in India we have completely separated access and quality? It seems very strange, but I think it's important for us to go into the details as to why this happened. Before I do that, I just want to briefly talk about two other points which for me were very significant. When we started from, say, 1964-65 onwards, and we look at just data, I'm not even looking at qualitative studies, we find that gradually different kinds of people are going to different kinds of schools. When I went to school in the early 60s and through the 60s, I did not go to any private school, went to a government school, and many people like me went to government schools and were able to actually compete with and match anybody else who went to Good Shepherd Convent in Chennai. It was not the difference was not so stark. But today, the difference is extremely stark. In fact, if you try and interview people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, I mean in age, you will find that many successful civil servants, many successful professors, many successful scientists actually started off in a village school. They started off in a government school. And all of them will tell you stories of these amazing teachers and amazing headmasters who actually made a big difference in their lives. They taught them with care. If they did not get any support from home, they helped them in school. So it's not as if all teachers have been bad all the time. And even today, when you go around the country, you still meet people who have actually made a huge difference to the lives of very, very poor children. But the more worrying part is not that it's not that there are no more teachers like that. I for one don't believe that teachers are the only villain of the piece. Yes, teachers have a role to play, but they're not the villain of the piece. We need to go slightly deeper into the whole relationship between teachers, schools, and society. Very recently, the ministry had commissioned a study on inclusion and exclusion. And we did this in 6 states, and we went to 20 schools in each state. I think it's a fairly large enough number for a detailed qualitative study. What we found was that subtle and very obvious forms of discrimination and prejudice exist within our society, within teachers, among the children, among the community. So it's not only about who goes to school, but it also happens on what happens when they reach the school. I don't remember at all in the school that I studied in, there were children who were children of Jawans, there were children of government peons, there were children from neighborhood. I don't remember any teacher trying to tell them that you cannot study because your father is a Jamadar. But over and over again, we got this message in the study that we did. And it was very disturbing. And this is not just in one state. But the other side of it was that in every state there were 2 or 3 schools where this did not happen. Where a very strong headmaster or a very strong group of teachers made sure that there was no discrimination inside the school. That nobody called a child by the caste name or by the disability. Because it's a very common thing to call a child by the disability the child has. I don't want to bore you with data, so I'm going to just skip all the data so when the paper is published you can have a look at it. What I want to say is that this kind of discrimination which we see in schools also is happening at a different level when you look at higher education. A recent study or a recent paper by Weizkopf actually says 40% of higher education students are enrolled in relatively low prestige arts programs and bachelor's programs. The percentage for scheduled caste children is 60%. And this percentage for scheduled tribe children is 75%. Which means even when we are scheduled caste and scheduled tribe children and rural children finish school and they want to go to college, they are predominantly going to colleges which are offering arts as what Suman Titmus many, years ago in 1972 called D-grade colleges. somewhere it is not only the discrimination that's happening inside the school, but also who is going to wear what kind of school. And what happens when they go to institutions? What happens to children who come through reservation into premier institutions in India? What happens to them? So I think somewhere we need to look at the whole, not only the experience of education that of all children and young people, starting from preschool right up to the university, but also this segregation that we're talking about is not just happening at the school level. It has happened at secondary school, it's happening at higher education, it's happening at all levels. In fact, what is quite interesting is as we go up, the percentage of institutions that is government run actually comes down. It's only in elementary that you have close to 80% institutions that are run by government. In secondary, it drops to 37%. So somewhere, when we are moving from elementary right up, it's not only the different kinds of providers are providing education, but the differentiation and exclusion is taking on a totally different kind of shape. And I wanted to bring this backdrop because it's for us it's very important to understand why what happened in India from 1960s onwards. You see, India, after 1947, what happened? Primary education did not receive the kind of attention that higher education received right up to the 60s, or 70s, or even I would say 80s. It's not that education on the whole was neglected by independent India. Education was very selectively promoted. There was a time for technical institutions. There was a time when many good government schools were set up. The Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan was set up in the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s. So there, and you find at different points of time the government's emphasis was very different on what was a priority for them. That was sort of politically driven at any given point of time. But that was not driven by what is the need on the ground. That was not driven by what is it that India needs or the young people of India need. Right up to the 1950s and 60s, education was seen as being coterminous with quality. We did not separate education and quality. It was unheard of in 1950s and 1960s that your child went to school but did not learn how to read or write. That your child went to school but could not subtract or add or divide. It was quite unthinkable. Notwithstanding the fact that they followed traditional pedagogy, notwithstanding the fact that the whole attitude towards education was different. But somehow, after the late 1960s and 70s, the situation started changing. What happened? What happened was very interesting. That if you look at the late 60s and 70s, more and more poor people started enrolling their children in school. More and more people from diverse poverty backgrounds, different castes and communities started bringing their children to school. This was also the time when private schools started increasing in numbers. And first it was the upper middle class and the rich who shifted their children from government schools to private schools. Then the ordinary middle class people started shifting their children from government schools to private schools. And slowly and steadily we come in a situation today where anybody with means would like to shift their child from a government to a private school. So when our civil servants, when our teachers, when our petty bureaucrats at the district or block level or even in a place like Delhi had already shifted their children either to a private school or to a Navyug school or a very fancy Pratibha Vidyalaya in Delhi, there was no need for you to make sure that the government schools actually function properly. There was no compulsion whatsoever. So we started neglecting the government schools. We didn't care. We've seen this in our own families. My sister and I always went to government schools. My brothers were much younger, 8 years and 10 years younger. They were not sent to government schools. They were sent to Don Bosco. So somewhere, it happened in our own lifetime that the choices that the middle class and the vocal people with voice made had a huge impact on the education system. We no longer really cared about whether our government schools were teaching, whether our teachers were coming or not. There was also another very disturbing trend that emerged in the late 1960s. I'm not saying that teachers were always insulated from politics. But after mobilization of teachers, as the last mile political activists of political parties really gained momentum towards the end of it actually started in the 1970s. We know what happened in West Bengal, which at one point of time boasted one of the very good education systems. But from 1977 to 2007, we have seen the destruction of the West Bengal primary school system. Hardly any teaching and learning happens, and the quality plummets. There was a time when West Bengal was on par with Tamil Nadu or Gujarat or Maharashtra. That is not the case today. This has happened in state after state after state. So there was a larger political environment in which school teachers, especially primary school teachers, became a very important political force. This was also the time when maybe teachers' unions became very strong. And when I was doing some work on the basic Shiksha schools in Bihar in 1991, I was wondering what happened to these basic Shiksha schools. The minute the basic Shiksha school teachers were merged along with the teaching cadre of rest of the schools, the decline of the basic Shiksha schools actually started. And later on they actually disappeared. So somewhere it is also what happened in the larger polity. The third very important reason why quality and access got completely separated was starting from the mid-1980s, EFA movement and all these global movements, government started monitoring education only through enrollment data. So it became a data-driven system. As long as the district administration or the state government can show that enrollment rates are going up, nobody asked another question. Never mind the government's own data was telling you 57% dropped out after primary. But the real monitoring was done on enrollment. And the whole old inspectorate system where somebody actually went to the school to see what was happening, whether teaching learning was happening, completely fell by the wayside. And what is more depressing is that when DPEP was launched, we thought we actually had a lot of hopes for India. But what happened under DPEP? Yes, many school buildings got built. Yes, a formal template was created to send to every district for district planning. Many more teachers were appointed. Lots and lots of training programs happened. Teachers were trained and trained and trained and trained. But nobody bothered to find out what and how much are children learning. Are children learning at all? What I'm going to say may be very controversial. Essentially, starting from the 70s, the Indian school education system became accountable to no one. Not accountable to parents, not accountable to children, because your monitoring system was only on how many children you are enrolling at different stages, how many teachers have you appointed, how many buildings have you built, how many hand pumps have you sunk, how many toilets have been created. So we started monitoring on inputs. So when a system starts monitoring itself only based on inputs, then what happens? People really don't care about the outcome. What is measured is what gets done. And we know that. We are not measuring learning. We are not measuring what is happening inside the school. The second is even more controversial. There was this no detention policy. Yes, Finland and Poland also have a no detention policy, but it doesn't work that way in those countries. In India, the no detention policy became a very good excuse for teachers and the school establishment and the education establishment to promote children from one grade to the next and the next and the next without even trying to find out what and how much are children learning. So you can reach class 5. And as Asad finds out, 50% of children can't read a grade 2 level text. Why are we surprised? The problem is not with the no detention policy. Problem is with the framing of the no detention policy and how it is communicated down the line. The idea was not to shame children by detaining them. Idea was not to traumatize children by detaining them. The idea was not to let them go from one class to the other so that when they reach end of primary cycle, they're most traumatized because they don't know how to read or write. In fact, we have shifted that trauma to a different level. We have actually cheated our children. The third, which is talked about a lot, and I was in fact in two minds whether I should talk about it or not, especially on Teachers' Day. But I felt it's important to talk about it even on Teachers' Day. The number of days the school actually works could range from 140 days a year to 200 days a year. And Rukmini and others are sitting here, they will tell you actually the reality on the ground is varies from state to state, from using the state from school to school. And teacher absence rate, whatever we may say, it remains quite high. When the study was first done, it was around 25%. Maybe it's come down. Maybe the way we are presenting the figures are very different. But all I know is that in the last 15 years, I must have visited at least 15 or 20 states in this country. And I'm a great one for doing actually field-based qualitative research. But I find that in most situations, what I find is if 5 teachers are appointed to a school, I've never seen all 5 teachers present on the same day. In Tamil Nadu and in Kerala, you will have a leave application there, so that's immediately. But incidents may be less. So even though technically there is one teacher for each class, the reality is there is one teacher teaching 2 classes, sometimes 3 classes. And the class that gets most neglected is grade 1. So in grade 1, they don't learn the basics. And we know with global research that early reading is very important. If a child doesn't learn to read and get the basic mathematical abilities in grade 1, 2 and 3, it's very difficult for the child to move on ahead unless something drastic is done. The important issue, which again may be controversial, is that the right to education has stipulated norms for basic infrastructure, facilities, teacher-pupil ratios, etc., etc., etc. And today, most state governments are running after private schools to make sure that they adhere to those norms. Who is asking the government schools whether you are adhering to those norms? Does the right to education only apply to private schools and small private schools and one small dukan in a little slum colony? The children are coming there because when they go to the local municipal school, nothing much is happening. The problem is that we've had so many wonderful plans. But what happens on the ground is very, very different. I'd like to briefly touch on secondary education, and then I would like to move on to what I feel could be done. You know, the situation is not very different at the secondary level. In fact, last couple of years I have started looking at secondary education. Government schools in many districts, in both educationally forward as well as backward states, have very poor infrastructure, inadequate teachers. They have more teachers in language and Sanskrit and physical education than they have in maths and science. And why? We are discovering in the current ongoing study that we're doing is that most of the secondary schools for girls don't offer science or maths. They're only offering Hindi, Sanskrit, etc. in classes 11 and 12. They don't have science labs. They don't have anybody to teach them mathematics. And in many tribal areas also, whether it is a girls' school or a boys' school, there's no science. Let's forget about tribal areas. I did a walk in Tughlakabad, which is right next door. And we were doing a focus group discussion with girls. What do you want to become? The girls said, we know A&M बनेंगे तो अच्छा होगा, हमें नौकरी वगैरह मिल जाएगी. पर दीदी हम बन ही नहीं सकते क्योंकि हमारे स्कूल में साइंस ही नहीं पढ़ाते हैं. This is a senior secondary girls school in Tughlakabad. Why? Why do we have a system where we are forcing children to only the art stream? Why are we not teaching them science? And then we say in secondary school, we're not getting science teachers. Well, how will we get science teachers if we're not willing to teach? So the kind of issues that we are grappling with in elementary and secondary are very different. Secondary schools may not have this all problem of teacher absenteeism, etc., because they're all clustered. They're in big, small towns or big villages and clusters. So there is some monitoring. There are lots of teachers. The headmasters have more powers, etc. But the issues in secondary schools are very different. But interestingly, the problem is not a lack of financial resources. Under RMSA has been on Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan. It's been on for 2.5 years. You don't see any impact of that in many of these places. Maybe you see it in the cities and it will slowly come. Before I go into what I feel can be done, I think I'm just reaching the end of my time. I'd like to basically talk about why the Polish example was so exciting for me. Or why is it that some countries have been able to turn the system around? In fact, one teacher apparently in one of the schools there said, we know more about our children than any test can tell us. What does that mean? That the pupil-teacher ratios are very low. The teacher knows every child, so you don't need to have public examinations and standardized testing all the time to make sure that children are learning. And most importantly, what really impressed me was, they started a recruitment drive at the university level and said that the best minds and the best students should come into school. And they actually went about doing a policy whereby they started attracting good people into the teaching profession. Essentially what Poland tells you is that no one measure actually works. It has to be systemic overall. If we have to worry about teachers, we need to start from preschool onwards. Because if we have children who reach high school, who don't have any basic skills, they probably do something and manage to get whatever, 30%, 40%, 50%, and just scrape through at different levels. And given the competition that we have, they are the ones who will end up becoming school teachers. Because the best minds will want to sit for the IIT entrance. The rest would want to come to Delhi University or go to Calcutta or Chennai or some Loyola or some good college. Go do a management degree, want to become engineers. And people who have no other option actually end up becoming school teachers. So this is a really warped system. And it is a warped system because we have devalued the education system to such an extent that nothing short of a complete shake-up will actually do. I don't want to dwell a lot on the teachers or have written about it and about why is it the teachers are demotivated and disheartened and what are the factors that lead to them. You can read that in the paper, but I would really like to move on to what is it that we can do. It's universally accepted that there are three factors that influence the education system. One is inputs. Facilities, teacher-pupil ratios, student enrollment, incentives, midday meals, science teachers, laboratories. Second is pedagogical processes in the classroom and the people who actually drive the pedagogic process. Who drives the pedagogic process in the classroom? The teachers. It's about who the teachers are, what they are, what they know, what support mechanisms they have. And third, overall governance of the school system. I haven't even touched on corruption and rent seeking because I didn't have time, and I think the audience here is very familiar with it. We know that expenditure on input has been going up steadily. But unfortunately, all the planning that we have done since 1994, Grand VPEP launch, we pushing more of the same. More buildings, more training, more facilities, more enrollment. I think it's time for the education community to start thinking very differently. And it's important for the bureaucracy to think differently. Today is Teachers' Day. Maybe it's a day when we all remember the teachers, we honor them. I always remember some of the teachers whom I had in school and college on this day. Maybe we need to start with teachers and initiate a nationwide dialogue with them and take them on board to reform the recruitment, academic support, monitoring, and teacher management system. I think it's high time we really started a dialogue with teachers at all levels. With lots of young people from universities, with lots of people from the media, from civil society, just going and actually dialoguing with teachers. What are we doing to our children? How is it that we can reform it? Nothing short of a social movement. I know you can't dismiss all these teachers tomorrow. And it's not right. I think we need to initiate a dialogue. And we also need to remember there's something fundamentally wrong in the way we manage our teachers. I think the way we manage our teachers needs to be completely overall. And I'm so happy Mr. Amarjit Singh is sitting here, who's actually on the hot seat when it comes to teachers in the ministry. We need to look at teachers as a professional cadre. We need to also treat teachers as individuals. We also need to treat teachers as experts. We also need to look at them as people who are accountable to someone. If I am placed on a pedestal does not mean that I am not accountable. So I think valuing them, treasuring them, providing education, providing support, providing academic support has to go hand in hand with a very strong mechanism of accountability and monitoring. But why has this not happened? Because our governments have swung like a pendulum. Suddenly once we heard, we can't have regular teachers, let's have all contract teachers. Contract teachers are like daily wages, wo to kaam karenge. And then we say, no, that's terrible. How can we treat teachers like that? So let's make them all regular and not them accountable at all. I think we need to find a middle path. I wouldn't even use the word middle path. I think we have to find a new path, a radically new path, on how we engage with our teachers, how we work with our teachers, and how we get the teaching community itself to start addressing the issue of learning of children. Maybe the best way to move forward is to announce that learning is the only goal of education. Enrollment is not our goal. We're not worried about enrollment and dropout rates. We're also not worried about whether you have built your buildings or not built the buildings. Those are important. But that cannot become your primary goal. Your primary goal has to be learning. And this has to be made non-negotiable, and the entire education system has to revolve around that one goal. Please don't think I'm arguing for mechanical testing of all children on a daily basis all the time. No, I'm not. What I'm arguing for is an effective system that will rescue children from the cumulative burden of not learning. That is what I'm saying. Every child needs to be rescued from the cumulative burden of not learning. It's a burden that so many children carry. It is a burden of the voices of children that I've heard. That koi nahi padhata hame. Koi chemistry teacher nahi hai, koi math teacher nahi hai, koi nahi padhata. I think we have to rescue our children, because that burden is much, much greater than the burden, any other burden the child will face in life. Let us not see the whole education system from the eyes of the elite schools of Delhi, Mumbai and Chennai, which is what journalists love to do. Majority of our schools actually don't know how much important children are learning. Education Initiative's own learning assessment in private schools actually tell you that. The right to education actually best serves the right to learn. And therefore, being promoted from one grade to the next is actually you're violating the right of the child, especially if you're promoted without learning. What do they do in Poland? The teachers say 30% of their time is actually spent doing remedial education within the classroom, which means they're working with small groups of children. So there are 5 or 7 children in the class who have not been able to master a particular level. They're actually working with them inside the classroom. The teacher should not be made accountable to go through the syllabus. They should not be made accountable for completing the prescribed textbooks. They should not teach to the curriculum. They should actually teach the children. And what do you mean by teach to the children? I think somewhere the boundary between regular teaching and remedial teaching needs to go. Remedial has to go hand in hand with regular teaching on a daily basis inside the classroom. And if required, if necessary, it's very important for us to do that alongside, even introduce evening classes, get children to stay back after school. Have special teachers who are there available in the school. I'll give you one example. Whenever people, have you ever been to a school which is run on the Montessori method? Some schools do. So there's a group of children who are falling behind, you make them into a separate group and let them engage with that level inside the same classroom. And somewhere I think we need to bring down the pupil-teacher ratio in primary, that is classes 1 to 5 to 1:20. Only when we do that can teachers actually teach every child. Because this 1:35 also is very high for primary classes. You can hike it up from class 6 onwards. And alongside the one other idea which is not mine, is that headmasters and school leaders have to be made fully in charge of the school, including signing the salary slips of the teachers, including granting leave to the teachers, including planning the training of the teachers. So headmaster should be able to call the block resource center or the cluster resource center and say, I have 3 teachers who need support in A, B, C. So when can you organize the training for my teachers for this support? So the queue for what academic training the teachers need should not come from some bureaucrat sitting in the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan Directorate in the state headquarters. They cannot prepare these hard spot books which they prepare and then have one cascade training right through the state, thinking that all teachers want to learn about how to teach fractions. So I think somewhere we need to take the headmaster in the school. So the headmaster should become a school leader. And we should empower, train and support the school leader, maybe with few people from within the community. And the headmaster should also have adequate resources to hire local teachers for supplementary teaching inside the school. So if a child is coming from landless labor family and does not have anybody in the family who knows how to read and write, there must be some mechanism in which that child should be able to get support within the school. Because I'm saying this because it's absolutely essential to bring the strong foundation at primary stage. Because unless we focus on early reading and early learning, we cannot reform the school system. We need to make sure that every single school in the country comes up to the basic minimum acceptable level. Not only in infrastructure. I think there has to be other benchmarks that we need. Another very controversial, but many people are talking about it, I think teachers need to be appointed to a school and not to a system. If you don't want to work in the rural area, don't apply for the job. If you don't want to live in that rural area, don't apply. This is really terrible. You go around the country and you'll find that schools near the road will have a pupil-teacher ratio of 1:20 and 1:15 or even 1:8. Because teachers who have been posted in remote areas have got themselves transferred or temporarily seconded. So I think somewhere we need to look at who the teacher is, and the teacher and the school have to be together. Maybe after teaching for 8 or 10 years, they can ask for a change. And of course, transfers, postings and career opportunities need to be somewhere discussed and come from the school with the headmaster having a say in it. Today the headmaster has no power. Today the headmaster has absolutely no powers in our primary school system. Maybe in secondary schools they have a little more power. The bottom line really is that the entire education system has to make sure children realize the right to learn and not just a right to be enrolled in the school. Thank you very much.